All right, for all you fans of sci-fi and fantasy out there, in the last video, which I probably uploaded just before this one, I announced my new epic fantasy, the Xaidra cycle, which starts with book one, Godless, and I rambled for a while about some details about the book and the magical elements within it, and a little bit about my backstory of coming up with the concept. It's been brewing for a long time, and now that I've got about 8 books under my belt in other series, now I decided to finally take a crack at this, and I decided to give y'all a chapter reading. So, without further ado, I am going to read to you from Godless, book one of the Xaidra cycle. And I have the book on screen here as I'm going through it, so you can join me, read along. If you hate my voice, you could always mute me and just follow along as I scroll. And without further ado, here's chapter one of Godless. Cozy up and enjoy the ride. Godless, Book 1 of the Xaidra Cycle, by Edward Nile. Chapter 1, The Silence. 20 years ago, Karn region, beholden to Belkas the war god. A ballista shot crashed against the port side of the land barge, rocking the giant vessel in place. Yarn knew men and women were dying out beyond the bulkheads, cutting, stabbing, struggling in the dirt and blood of combat while he sheltered within the hulking vehicle. He attended a different kind of battle, a different struggle for life. "Keep pushing, Mira. You can do this." Mira's screams drowned out Yarn's encouragements. He could do nothing else but hold her hand. Her grip was strong, the muscles of her arm corded tight. A woman from any other faith would not be able to clutch the hardened leather and mail of an armored gauntlet so firmly. But like Yarn, the surgeon, and the midwives attending her, Mira was of Belkas. Before her belly swelled with this, their first child, Mira had fought and killed alongside Yarn, a warrioress loyal to Belkas's red moon, her soul attuned to the war god's calling. And she will fight again, Yarn thought, as will our child. A fresh convulsion rocked Mira's body, her back arching as another scream tore from her. Yarn traced the bulge of her belly with his other gauntlet. 2 bumps poked from inside, stretching the skin as the unborn infant struggled. "Already a fighter," Yarn said. "A warrior in the womb." But he could not believe the boast. Something was wrong. Some time between observing the battle outside his land barge and now, a hopelessness Yarn could not describe had taken hold. Was this some sort of premonition? Were his wife and unborn doomed? The barge rocked to one side, its wooden construction creaking under its own weight. There was a crash and a rumble of great wheels as the vessel righted itself. "Priest Yarn!" came a call from above. "Come quickly!" Mira's roving gray eyes, bloodshot and faded with the exhaustion of her labor, rolled to Yarn and held. "Go," she painted. "I will be fine." Yarn wished he was as confident as his wife sounded. From the rictus of pain to the sheen of sweat on her bare body, she looked like she was already at Vortis's gates. "After every war I've been in, the lives I've taken, can I really be so green to this battlefield?" Yarn was in his 33rd year, but this had him feeling like a youth engaging in his first infantry charge, spear ungainly in his clammy, terrified grip. "Priest!" "By the siblings!" He kissed his wife's hand and rose. "Take care of her," he said to the midwives, putting all the command of combat order behind the words. The effect was marred by the gruffness in his tone, the way his voice caught halfway through saying it. He'd never seen a birth before, but Yarn knew how dangerous the process could be. Even if his barge made it through what was happening outside, this could still be the last time he saw his wife alive. Nurses and midwives moved about the small cabin by lantern light, changing out pots of water in bloody rags, wiping sweat and other fluids from their groaning patient. The stench of blood and sweat and sour breath, the screams and confused movement, indistinguishable from the closed quarters of a spear charge. A battle, Yarn thought. It's all just one battle. He felt like he was abandoning Mira to the blades of a host of enemies, but knew there was nothing he could do for her in this fight. He needed to protect his army, and this barge, if their child was to have a chance. "The fates," he heard one of the midwives say as he walked down the corridor. "Where are the crones?" The barge rocked again. sending Yarn crashing against reinforced bulkheads as he ascended the wooden ladder to the deck. Wood gave way to charnel horror once Yarn was above. Gray skin, peppered with scales and boils, was stretched along railings set with the sharp, jagged teeth of chaos wraiths as a deterrent to boarders. Broken wraith teeth and bones formed tiles to cover the deck, while skin and bone coated the outer hulls and wheels. All this, as well as the mottled, grotesque sails of wraith hide, were made to shield the land barges of Gratis the Harbinger from Niram's wind, the mad god's traveling storm. The pandemonium only grew worse on deck. Galing wind tore at sails and ballistas, sending tornadoes of harsh dust from the great churning wheels on either side. Yarn squinted through it and grabbed hold of a banister to look out on the battlefield. Niram's wind, also known as the Chaos Storm, was long behind Gratis's caravan, a nightmare they had passed through with minor casualties thanks to their hideous shielding. One of many so-called blasphemies which had incited the other war priests to rebel against their harbinger. The red banner of Gratis's crusade was the true heresy, an inversion of the flag of the pantheon in which Belkis's crest replaced that of the day god in the prominent center. War's crest, placed larger than the other gods in declaration of impending conquest. The banner, the final straw, the proof that the harbinger of war intended to deliberately upend the balance among the pantheon. It flapped and twisted violently in the gusts of a storm, even more chaotic and unnatural than Niram's wind. Lightning split the air from rainless clouds. The bright, momentary bolts tinged crimson in the spinning miasma of arid dust kicked up by the winds. All of it seemed to have its nexus in a great pillar of swirling air, a mountainous tornado of crimson dust and fire that disappeared into the unfathomable sky. The base of the vortex churned through the ranks of armies which tried to scramble out of its path, each man and woman smaller than an insect compared to the impossible force that listed toward them. As small and insignificant as the soldiers appeared, their passing went with even less fanfare. The tornado erased them by the hundreds, and Yarn found himself scanning the vortex for some sign of the soldiers whipped into its wind. He saw no more of those lost. By Belkis above, what is this? No sprite could commit so much destruction. Not even a harbinger could wield such force all at once. If it was an artifice of Lanny or Rayshard's making, the storm made no effort to pick its targets. Men from Yarn's army were swept away as surely as those of his enemies. Dozens of kilometers across the flattened bowl of Failor Vale, Yarn saw land barges flying both Gratis's colors and those of the opposing war priests, torn asunder by these unnatural winds. Their debris churned into the vortex. Others plummeted into fissures, which opened below as Xaidra herself rumbled and shook. What could cause this? That sinking, empty feeling he denoted earlier reached through the fog of confusion like a nagging question. It was more than dread, more than fear of an impending defeat or even of the loss of his wife and child. It felt as though all hope, even the possibility of hope, had been dampened, a wet cloth snuffing out the embers of his dreams, an anchor on his soul that tried to drag him down and drain away his will to live. He looked away from the tornado, from the destruction devouring his people across the plain. Yarn looked down to the rumbling wheels of his barge, their massive wraith-spiked treads chewing earth, throwing stones high in the air in all directions. He imagined jumping into that grinding churn, letting it destroy him, a moment of pain, and then the cold bliss of Vortis's rivers. "Priest Yarn!" Yarn shook himself. One of his younger lieutenants was tugging at the bottom of his jerkin. Barris was on his knees, clutching the banister with his other hand. The young man's face was deathly pale, his lips bloodless and quivering, hands clenching and unclenching on the hardened wraith skin. He looked up at Yarn with haunted eyes, and Yarn realized the emptiness was not merely felt by him. Soldiers all along the barge's deck were in similar condition, some collapsed on the planks, some wandering about in a daze. One thing they all did was look up to the sky. Yarn followed suit and regretted it. Belkis's moon was the home of the war god. It was one of the myriad celestial bodies that represented the pantheon, the realms of the gods which dotted the infinite void, visible even during the day-moon's reign, when the sparkling pinpoints of light that formed the star path were hidden. Though it was only in its ascendance 1 year out of every 20, the red moon's glow had been a constant in Yarn's life. Large or small, the war moon made its path across Xaidra's violet sky, hidden only by clouds which sometimes obscured every god-moon. There should have been clouds now, what with the raging winds and the tornado of dust churning between the Titan mounts, but the sky was maddeningly clear beyond the tornado. Clear enough for Yarn to see the light of Belkis's moon flickering. He watched it wink, dark and bright, dark and bright. Then in one final blink, it went dim, and stayed that way, a disk of dull maroon where a shining ruby had once loomed, a candle blown out, leaving naught but a dark ember in place of its flame. The feeling that had plagued Yarn became horribly clear, recognizable even in its alienness. A feeling neither he nor any mortal of the faiths could imagine, let alone understand. Like all faithful, Yarn had been born under the sign of his god, born connected to Belkas, feeling war's influence within him, even before the crones declared which faith was his. He'd never known an existence in which that voiceless, invisible, yet tangible presence was not felt in his soul, a warm glow within him, an assurance of his path and place in the world. It was as constant, real, and vital as the air in his lungs, the blood in his veins, and it was gone. Not muted or lessened, not muffled as a voice heard through a wall. The war god's presence was just gone. Yarn felt true panic for the first time in years. Primal terror, long ago controlled on the battlefield, tamed within the inescapable rush of combat, where a well-placed spear or arrow could end him at any moment. That fear returned now, overshadowing the chaos around him, making it all fade out to leave him alone in an unnatural bubble of silence. He found himself absorbed by that dark disk, its dulled crimson tint the only thing differentiating it from the black moon of the death god Vortis. "Priest Yarn?" Barris must have been speaking for a while, repeating Yarn's name to his oblivious ears. He blinked at the lieutenant. Their gaze held a mutual understanding this time, a shared horror beyond anything the blood and gore of battle could induce. "Yes?" "The enemy." Barris took in a gulp of air, wiped at his sweat-beaded brow. "They're routing, sir." Yarn blinked again, feeling dazed, and looked back onto the battlefield. The storm tore through slit trenches and field weaponry, disintegrating land barges in moments, their debris reduced to little more than added material in the growing tornado. Enemy barges, marked not so much by the banners of their priests, but by the lack of chaos shielding. Gratis had been a madman and a genius, to use Niram's wind as a causeway to flank his opponents, a way to speed his course and come at the enemy from directions they weren't prepared for. The other clan priests refused to do the same. Routing, what an understatement. A detached military term when compared with the mad panic of reality. Both sides were running for their lives, except for some individuals who stood still, as transfixed by the darkened god moon as Yarn had been, severed from all they'd known in one unfathomable stroke. But why? Why would their god turn away from them as they spilled blood in his name, carried forth the ritual for which he favored them? "Gratis," Yarn said. "The Harbinger, where is he?" "He was down there with the men, sir, fighting, as always." Yarn cursed under his breath. Only a Harbinger could make sense of this, one of the chosen, who not only spoke to his god but heard war's voice in turn. A Harbinger was blessed with strength and powers beyond mortal men. Blessed with long life. Perhaps Gratis was unharmed amid the scrambling masses, but if so, he was of no use right then. Someone cried out Yarn's name, bringing his attention to the deck hatch, where one of the midwives was waving for him, her hair a mess, her clothing torn. Torn and covered in fresh blood. "Priest, hurry!" "What should we do?" asked Barris to Yarn's back. The man's tone was flat, like a sleepwalker's. "Sound the horns. Bring our people back to the barges." Yarn heard the same flatness in his own voice. He flung himself down the narrow ladder. Yarn heard his child's cries before he reached the birthing room. The infant was not the only one screaming. Yarn rushed down the tight corridor, spurred by scuffling noises, the crash of wooden furniture, and the shattering of pottery. He burst in to find a scene as chaotic and bloody as the one he'd just left. Tables and chairs lay toppled on a blood-speckled floor, along with shards of a water basin, its contents sloshed about by the booted feet of a pair of soldiers who grappled with a slight figure. They stood between the figure and Mira, who lied unconscious on her cot, her legs propped open as the surgeon tended to her, midwives wiping her body down with rags, already pink and sodden with water and blood. Yarn gulped. The gory mess the surgeon ministered to shocked him. He'd seen worse, done worse to others by far. What follower of Belkas hadn't? But to see his wife in that state, helpless and without a sword in hand, as she bled, was too much. He knelt by Mira and pulled his right gauntlet free before taking her hand in his, feeling her palm and slender fingers. Her hand was cool and clammy, almost corpse-like. But her fingers twitched in response to his touch, as Mira drew in shallow, murmuring breaths. "What happened?" he rasped. Somewhere in the room, a baby continued to cry. Their baby. Complications. Elaf hesitated with the word. The surgeon sounded perplexed, as though any part of the flesh could be mysterious to one who'd seen it cut to pieces as much as he had. What kind of complications? By all the siblings, she looks like she's been torn open. He bit off the end of the sentence, finding the words hard to utter, even in anger. The scuffling continued, soldiers' boots scraping shards of pottery as they readjusted their hold on whoever had threatened Yarn's family. The child is not typical. Yarn waited for elaboration, but only got the clack of surgical tools as Elaf continued his work, refusing to look up and meet his gaze. The baby kept crying, loud and hearty, but where was it? Yarn looked to the midwives, searching for a bundle, for a squirming form to be the source of the wailing. But they held nothing. A tiny movement caught Yarn's attention. He looked past the feet of a young midwife, herself one of Mira's trusted fighting women. Ivna, pick up my child. Ivna sidestepped away from the squirming bundle of cloth until she bumped against the wooden bedpost. I'm sorry, Priest Yarn, but I can't. Confusion quickly gave way to fury. You left my child on the floor? He rose to his full height, towering over the woman. And now you tell me no? Pick up the child. I won't touch it! She spat out the final word, a vehemence in her tone and face that Yarn could tell masked something else. The warrioress was frightened. But what was there in a baby to be scared of? He pushed past her and went to the squirming shape, its mewling louder, now that he was closer, a high-pitched noise that grated on the ear. He put a hand on the infant. That was when Yarn noticed how his breath misted before him. It must not be allowed to live. Yarn turned to the soldiers again, and got his first clear look at what they were restraining. Eyeless, rotten cavities looked at him from a stone-gray face, as wrinkled as a crumpled sheet of paper. Black veins pulsed from a pair of thin, obsidian lips, overshadowed by a nose that was too narrow, too upturned, its nostrils reptilian slits. Irregularly shaped ears ended in jagged, upturned points, alongside a bald head framed by the hood of the spindly creature's tattered black cloak. That explained the cold, and part of the dread in the air. It fell on the Fates, also known as Crones, to declare the faith of newborns. Every community, regardless of faith, found itself host to these creatures at one time or another. They shuffled in unannounced, asking nothing but demanding respect as powerful servants of the pantheon, creatures answerable to a deity more ancient and unfathomable than all of the siblings. An elongated hand clawed at the soldiers, black, sharp nails seeking flesh. Altessa's crest was a black mark on the crone's palm. If one was unlucky, and the prophecy of the twin fates placed their newborn beneath the sign of a different god, it was the crones themselves who would see the child taken away and brought to people of its faith. Add that to their frightening appearance, and these seldom occurrences were more than enough to spur folk tales of eyeless monsters, eating unruly children and cursing entire villages. Some claimed to have seen what was under a fate's cloak, but the story was always different. Leather wings like a plucked scrag, spikes and bulbous exoskeletons like a Haradir, the many-limbed, twisted horrors known as Chaos Wraiths. For Yarn's part, he wasn't sure there was anything underneath the tattered black garments, imagining instead that the hunched mockery of an old, eyeless woman hid something intangible beneath, a ghost, a sprite, a phantom. He didn't want to know. Once, the fates might have even been human, as some said, harbingers to the void goddess, given over entirely to the power of their deity. If that were true, Yarn definitely did not want to know what could turn a person into this. Talim, Orv, where's its twin? Yarn asked above the bundle's cries and the fates shrieking. We're not sure, priest. Orv kept a firm hand on the crone's wrist, keeping the black-nailed, hooked fingers clear of his face. Yarn would have to reward these men for the risk they took. He had seen what an enraged fate could do to a human, the corruption their blood curse wreaked on mortal flesh. Yarn met the crone's eyeless stare, knowing it could see him as clearly as he could see it. It must not live. That's what you said, hag, Yarn remarked. Why? A curse, ruin, dark vengeance. The crone's voice came out doubled, as though it and its absent twin spoke in unison. Black spit flew from its lips to sizzle and smoke on the wooden floor, leaving tiny, round scorch marks. Only iron and stone could withstand the black spit of a fate, and only then inscribed with the right God-script verse. The creature continued like this, interspersing the common Mirian language with a strange tongue unique to its kind. Its babbling was incoherent, rushed in the throes of some uncontrolled passion, as though it, like Evna the midwife, were somehow afraid of a newborn. Yarn turned his full attention to the bundle on the floor. He worked both hands beneath it and took the squirming form in his arms. The child felt warm and soft beneath the blanket, but for a pair of hard objects which had somehow made it into the wrappings. The midwife had even covered the baby's face, and again Yarn felt the urge to shove Evna into the bulkhead for her carelessness to his firstborn. War was an exacting god, but only those of Kresnak the Cruel would treat an infant like this, wrapped like a side of venison and discarded on the floor, perhaps to suffocate as it cried wordlessly for help. She will be punished, Yarn promised himself. He reached for the bit of blanket covering his child's face and peeled it back. His hand froze. Had he not stopped to collect himself, Yarn was sure he would have dropped the infant. If that was truly what Mira had birthed. My baby, Yarn's wife murmured. She was beaded with sweat, her eyes rolling. Fever had taken hold. She reached for the child, touching the skirt of Yarn's leather armor. Don't try to move, said Elaf in a crisp tone. I've numbed the tear, but you're still not stitched up. Mira's gray eyes focused, meeting Yarn's. Is it a boy? Yarn could not bring himself to check. He did not want to seem more. Yes, love, he said. A boy. Give him to me, Mira begged. Give me my son. She could not keep herself awake. Her eyes drifted closed, her hand flopping along the side of the bed. Mira! Yarn cradled the child against his breastplate with one hand and touched his wife's face with the other. She lives, said the surgeon, 2 fingers pressed to an artery along Mira's inner thigh. Whether she survives the night, however, only the gods can know. Vortis is reaping a bountiful harvest today. Yarn's lip quivered. For your sake, you had best hope her soul is not among the crop. It was an empty threat, and Yarn knew it. People died even under the best care, and good surgeons were hard to come by. Elaf did not react, his head bent to his work, cool and detached. If the nature of the infant he'd just delivered affected the surgeon, Yarn could not tell. Soldiers crowded into the small doorway, their armor scratched and caked in dust and blood, faces dirty and tired. Report, Yarn demanded. The men had to visibly pull their attention to him. And away from the snarling, hissing crone. Nearly all our men are on board the barges and ready to evacuate, Priest Yarn. Nearly all those who still live, added the other soldier. Our enemies? The same. We heard their horns sound the retreat. We march on the Harbinger's orders. Where is Gratis? The men looked at one another. Yarn hammered a fist against the wooden bulkhead. Speak! Killed, Priest. Several of our men witnessed it. Dead? Yarn breathed the word as the midwives gasped. Even the men busy holding back the crone looked over. How? Yarn pressed. A Harbinger was worth 1,000 men or more in battle, with the strength to match. Yarn had never heard of one killed by mere spear thrust or arrow before. Their lives were extended by their connection to their god, allowing them to stay young and hale for centuries. It was one of our men, General. The soldier gulped as he spoke, though only his armor was seen, not his face. He cut Gratis's head off. Impossible. But Yarn could not say that with much confidence. Belkis's moon darkened above them, an unnatural upheaval of shaking earth, swirling wind, lightning and fire tearing their armies apart. A frightened crone. One of the ancient fates themselves reduced to a frantic, hissing animal. The malformed thing birthed from Mira's womb that even Yarn's most loyal warriors refused to touch. Nothing made sense. Dozens saw it, sir. Yarn saw the same hopelessness in these men that he'd first noticed in Barris's eyes above deck. The severing from Belkas, the sense that the war god had vanished. If a Harbinger could die, what of a god? Would Vortis claim one of his own? Could he? Yarn looked down at his child. But how could it be his or Mira's? How could this creature have come from them? Make way. Yarn shoved past the men. He turned back to look at his unconscious wife, with half a mind to threaten Elaf once more. He decided not to waste his breath. keep the crone under guard until I figure out what to do with it." He was not sure if he meant the fate or the squirming, crying bundle in the crook of his arm. "What are we to do, priest?" asked one of the newly arrived soldiers. Yarn struggled to come up with an answer. "Get the deck cleared and the barge moving." The wheels of the land barge ground into motion, bringing the behemoth of wood lumbering along on its path to escape the Titan mounts and the disaster unfolding amidst them. That pillar of swirling chaos continued, rising up toward Belkis's dead moon, as though being sucked into the void. Yarn probed that missing part of his soul, exploring the pain. His god had abandoned him, abandoned them all. The purpose for which every Belkin lived had been snuffed out. Part of why he wanted the deck to himself was to prevent his men from hurling themselves off the barge in despair. Having them all below to work the cranks and keep the vessel moving was an added boon. But, truly, he'd ordered it cleared so that he could be alone with his child. He peered down at the creature. It had stopped crying, tiny hands grasping the brooch of Yarn's red cloak. Its small, stubby arms were of nearly the same hue as the fabric. The baby's skin was deep crimson. A toothless mouth tried to suckle at the steel breastplate to no avail. The child cried anew. A baby. It was a baby. But of what species? A pointed black horn from a bald red head scraped against Yarn's armor. Feet with 3 fat toes apiece flailed free of the blanket as the child's wails competed against the rumble of the great wheels. A cry like that from a newborn so small was considered a good sign. It showed health, a warrior's strength, a soldier's resolve. Yarn felt the cold presence of the second fate before it spoke. "My sister spoke truly, Yarn." He glanced sideways at the crone. It drifted toward him, feet hidden in the trailing black tatters of its cloak. Assuming it had feet. Whatever the cloth was made from was like nothing Yarn had seen elsewhere. It seemed to absorb all light around it, to shift irrespective of the wind or the motions of the wearer, jagged ribbons of the garment reaching toward Yarn and curling back. It was rare to see a fate so exposed to the day moon's violet light. And Yarn was fascinated and repulsed to witness just how inhuman the crone truly was. If a physical difference existed between this creature and its twin below deck, Yarn had yet to observe it. The day was warm, yet Yarn's breath came out in white puffs of steam. "Your sister," Yarn put scorn into the word, "has clearly lost what passes for wits among your kind, hag. Whatever god-blighted force thrust you upon us, it was no desire of mine. Begone!" The crone's hairless eyebrows rose, stretching the empty sockets below in ghastly contortion. "We come where we are needed, mortal. Safeguards of the balance. You may question our usefulness all you wish, but you may not send us away, lest you wish to be cursed by creation itself." And what does killing this creature have to do with the balance? Crippled boys and girls are born every day, missing limbs, splotched skin, and worse. It is my choice whether I wish to rear a deformed child or not. "It will prove the death of you." The crone's voice took on that echo as its sister's had, the same voice with which crones pronounced an infant's faith, the voice of doom, the tone of prophecy. "It will prove the end of your lineage and the destruction of your faith. Your people's way of life will be no more." Yarn paused. He had never known one of the fates to lie, nor for their proclamations to prove false when spoken in that voice. He looked to the creature in his arms again, and found it looking back at him, blue eyes, as blue as pale sapphires, like Yarn's own, which Mira always said was her favorite part of him. The thought of his wife choked Yarn. For all he knew, Mira was already dead below, her life traded to bring this horrid thing into existence. It was the tale that shocked Yarn into what he did next. It slipped out from the blanket like a hairless red worm and draped itself over his vambrace. Yarn shouted in disgust and thrust his arm out over the barge's railing. The blanket came free and drifted down into the meat grinder of the great vessel's wheels, so that only the baby remained, dangling from Yarn's arm by its tail alone, with nothing but the deadly fall beneath. It screamed. He screamed. Yarn had not lied to Mira about the child's sex after all. The creature was male, a son. He and Mira had had a son, and it had already killed its mother, a son which would doom them all. The boy squirmed, flailing small hands and feet. His three-toed feet, his horns, his tail and red skin were unnatural. But other than that, Yarn could see features of himself in Mira. Could this truly be their son? "Do it!" The crone's doubled voice was a sibilant hiss in Yarn's ear, its breath an icy wind that sent a shudder down his spine. "Do it for your people, for your God." His God. What happened today? Yarn nudged his chin toward the vortex already shrinking as the barges rolled. The vessels of the opposing army had already gone from sight in another direction. Belkis's essence no longer speaks to me. The crone recoiled, uttering a gurgling noise of disgust. Disgust, or, again, fear. "A betrayal of the gods!" Its hiss rose in pitch until it was a shriek. "A war in the void!" And dropping this boy, will that bring Belkis back? There was no telling from beneath its cloak, but Yarn thought the crone was fidgeting. "This is beyond our sight," it said at last in a singular tone. "We know only the doom its life will bring upon you." It was the closest thing to a lie Yarn had ever heard one of its species utter. The crone did know something. If killing this child would bring Belkis back, the fates would be motivated to tell him, to influence him to kill the infant they so wanted dead. The baby tried to pull itself up by its tail, but dropped after rising only an inch or two, left dangling upside down from Yarn's arm. Even through his vambrace, Yarn could tell the newborn had a grip as strong as its hearty cries. The red infant's bare form still glistened with Mira's blood, where it had not dried to rusty ochre against its skin. A son. Mira had yearned after a son most of all. Yarn pulled the baby from the edge of the barge and held it close. "What are you doing?" the crone demanded. He walked to a pile of coiled rigging line and placed the boy atop it. This done, Yarn unclasped his cloak and tucked it around the child. The boy had stopped crying now. With the barge clear of the destruction of the battlefield, this left an odd cocoon of silence over the vessel's deck. "Fool!" shrieked the crone. Yarn felt the creature pass by him. With all the reflexes born of a fighter's life, he snatched the crone's bony wrist short of reaching his son. The tendrils of its cloak whipped out. His unarmored right hand slammed against the crone's neck. Yarn clenched and lifted the creature by its clammy throat. He carried the thrashing crone toward the edge of the land barge and held it over the railing until even the cloak's reach was well beyond his son. Yarn was amazed at the near weightlessness of the fate, thinking back to his theory that the creature had no corporeal form beneath the garment. The fate fixed Yarn with its eyeless gaze, wrinkled face scrunched in fury. No, Yarn decided, this monster could never have been human. Slit nostrils flared from a nose now flattened against the crone's contorted face. Combined with the pointed ears and flowing black cloak, the entire effect made Yarn think of one of the nocturnal flying rodents, which swarmed from the hollows of the Titan mounts with the sinking of the day moon. "You dare!" the crone snarled, as though Yarn's crushing grip on its windpipe did nothing. "The curse of your godless progeny will be nothing compared to what will rain upon you if you kill one of my kind, mortal." Yarn's teeth bared in a furious grin. "So you can die," he said. "That is good to know." Fury bled away from the crone's features. Yarn had heard legends of their kind being able to read human minds. He hoped it was true. He hoped this monstrous thing knew the strength of his conviction. "You cast your prophecies, cart away our newborns. Now you try to kill my son, and despite all your wisdom, all your mystical sight, you cannot tell me where my God has gone, nor guarantee his return. Your creature is godless." The crone's tattered cloak whipped about. "It will be your undoing." Godless? Yarn raised his eyes to Belkis's dark moon, listening with his heart for the warmth of the war god's blessing. He felt only the emptiness inside. Yarn looked down into the empty pits of the crone's eyes, letting the grin drop from his face. The fear in the crone's visage was unmistakable. He leaned his head forward. "We are all godless now." Yarn let go. The crone's fingernails tried to latch on to his right arm, tearing through the thin leather of his jerkin, leaving streaks of burning cold through the flesh beneath. The icy chill cut down to the bone, and Yarn screamed, pulling the limb close to him, even as he bent over the rail to watch the crone fall. Its black cloak flapped about like great wings. A horrid cackling rose as the crone began to drift. Yarn gasped, certain the fate would fly off to safety or zip back up to put those claws to his face. One wraith-skin-covered spoke caught on the cloak. The creature's laugh cut short. Its black-clad figure yanked down into the churning mess of earth and stone beneath the giant wheel. The eyeless creature let off a final deafening shriek before its voice was silenced. The scream of its twin rose to replace it. Yarn collapsed to his knees, ears pierced by the high-pitched screeching, an inhuman keen that vibrated through the deck itself. Eyes screwed shut, he clapped his left hand over an ear, mouth agape in a silent cry of pain. The second crone's screaming cut short after an interminable stretch of time. Yarn took the hand away from his ear to find beads of fresh blood on the palm of his gauntlet. One of his men must have incapacitated or killed the remaining crone. His right arm throbbed with a blinding agony. A torturous pain Yarn had initially fought past now consumed him. He fell in on himself, his forearm a bright, all-consuming flame of pain. So cold it felt as though he were being burned with ice. Yarn was barely cognizant of what happened around him, only that the deck filled with the sound of boots and voices. When he did finally come to some sort of conscious state, it was to find himself being loaded onto a stretcher, the child, his child, placed in the crook of his good arm at his own delirious command. The freezing agony had deadened his right hand and was spreading, creeping fresh pain up from flesh already lost to the crone's cursed touch. He risked a look at the injury and just as quickly screwed his eyes shut, though he knew the blackened rot of his arm would forever be etched in his mind. Not all the voices he heard were the murmur of his men. Already the howling, echoing laughter of Niram's wind began to surround the land barge as it drove into the chaos storm, the ever-moving realm of the mad god. "Mira," he croaked. "Does she live?" He wasn't sure if anyone answered before a wave of fresh torment plunged Yarn into blackness. All right, folks, that's Chapter 1 of Godless, the first book in the Xaidra cycle. I have about 12 or 13 chapters typed up and fairly edited, ready to go. I'm working on transcribing the chapters beyond that. Again, I am going for a release sometime between April and May. If y'all like this, I am more than willing to do a few more chapter readings of the subsequent chapters and get to at least some of the first major plot points, get you primed for the full novel. I'll probably be doing more video updates about the editing and formatting process of this book and just getting it ready for consumption. I have a map that is pretty much done. To be honest, like I said in my last video, a lot of false starts when it comes to working on something like this, and during one of those previous false starts, I made a map that it was good. It had a lot of good elements to it, but then I looked at it in light of the current run, the current attempt, the current draft, and I figured out how to make it even better. So I have the map, I have the Godscript lexicon, and the God glyphs, or the God crests, I should say. So I will, I'll be coming out with more content about Xaidra, and probably gonna intersperse that with some videos about just industry stuff, indie publishing, Big Five publishing, or Big Four, I should say. I'm aware, I think there was some news recently with, I can't remember if it was HarperCollins or one of the big publishers trying to sell the works of authors into for an AI data set and offering some kind of kiss-off money to authors. Other people have talked about this on the platform, but obviously, I'm not happy with the amount of AI being used by publishing houses, especially for cover designs. So I might yap a little bit about that. I have a little list of things I kind of want to ramble about, and if you're here for the ride, then you'll be subjected to those as well. In the meantime, let me know in the comments if you want more from Xaidra. Again, I'm, more than happy to share more of it and get y'all primed on, get y'all pumped for the full novel. And yeah, with that said, this is Edward Nile signing off.